they begin with the best of intentions. These empaths, these souls with porous boundaries and open hearts, are often the most intuitive among us. From early on, they feel the currents beneath the surface, the invisible tides of emotion, the subtlest changes in facial expression or tone. They do not merely understand others, they absorb them like finely tuned instruments. They resonate with the suffering, the tension, the desire of everyone around them, but in this constant resonance, they slowly lose the sound of their own song. The empath is a being birthed from both grace and wound, and in that paradox, we find the beginning of their eventual snapping, the sacred breaking that comes not from weakness, but from prolonged misalignment. You see, the empath is not inherently whole. No one is. The self is an alchemical crucible of opposites, light and dark, conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow. And the empath, by habit and compulsion, often devotes so much psychic energy to others that they forget to reckon with their own inner opposites. They suppress anger for the sake of peace. They deny resentment for the illusion of harmony. They repress their shadow to maintain the persona of the good caretaker. But what is denied in the psyche is not destroyed. It is merely displaced and driven into the unconscious, where it festers, weight, and accumulates charge. The shadow of the empath is particularly potent because it is comprised of everything they believe. They must never be selfish, cruel, indifferent, wrathful. The more devoutly they cling to their self-image of kindness, the more violently the shadow gathers force. And when that force reaches critical mass, it does not ask for permission. It erupts. This eruption, this snapping, is not a failure. It is a rebalancing. It is the unconscious self reclaiming its seat at the table of identity. To understand why the empath becomes the very shadow they feared, we must first explore why they feared it at all. Their fear of darkness is not a spiritual flaw, but a developmental one. Many empaths are shaped in early life by environments where love was conditional. If they were attuned, pleasing, and self-sacrificing, they were accepted. If they expressed anger, disappointment, or resistance, they were shamed or abandoned. Thus, a false dichotomy was born. Goodness equals survival, darkness equals danger. In Jungian terms, the empath forged a persona, the socially approved mask crafted to ensure love and belonging. This persona often takes the form of the healer, the helper, the one who never needs help. But behind every persona lies its repressed opposite, the shadow. And the more radiant the persona, the darker its shadow. The empath's kindness masks rage. Their patience hides resentment. Their devotion cloaks exhaustion. Their peace is often a negotiated truce with chaos, not a true absence of it. Now, imagine living decades under such psychic conditions. Every slight absorbed, never expressed, every boundary crossed, forgiven too quickly, every trauma bypassed in the name of understanding. Slowly, the empath becomes a vessel not only for their own pain, but for the pain of others. And because The unconscious does not distinguish between self and other in the same way the ego does. The empath's inner world becomes a swirling cauldron of unmetabolized grief, fear, and anger, some of which is not even theirs. Dreams begin to betray them. Once filled with angelic imagery or symbolic connection, they turn darker. Wolves, floods, and serpents appear. The dream ego begins to scream, to run, to kill, to devour. The empath may wake up sweating, confused, afraid of their own psyche. But this is the moment of initiation, the unconscious, that eternal mirror of truth, is revealing what the conscious mind has refused to see. The empath is not pure. No one is. And until they embrace their own capacity for darkness, they are not truly whole. This moment of snapping often manifests in relationships. A person whom the empath has supported endlessly, despite red flags, suddenly crosses a boundary that can no longer be ignored. The empath explodes sometimes with tears, sometimes with silence, sometimes with fury. Friends are shocked. She was always so sweet. He never raised his voice. But what they witnessed was not a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. The shadow had spoken, yet the work is not finished at eruption. The real alchemy begins when the empath chooses to integrate, not dissociate from this reclaimed power. Integration is not the same as indulgence. To integrate one's anger does not mean to become abusive. To acknowledge one's shadow does not mean to unleash it unchecked. Rather, integration means allowing the full spectrum of the self to exist consciously. In dialogue, in dynamic tension, it means saying, yes, I am kind, and yes, I am capable of cruelty. I choose each day who I shall be. Here, the archetype of the wounded healer becomes relevant. Chiron, pierced and immortal, taught others what he could not yet heal in himself. The empath, too, becomes a true healer, not through perfection, but through embodiment. Not by staying in the light, but by descending into their own underworld and emerging with treasure insight, resilience, clarity. When they stop running from their shadow, they begin to understand others, not just as victims or abusers, but as whole beings with complex psyches just like themselves. The empath who has not met their shadow cannot truly protect themselves. They will forever be prey to energy vampires, narcissists, and users, because their own psyche forbids them from recognizing cruelty in others. It is too resonant with the denied parts of themselves. But once they have looked into the mirror of the unconscious and said, I, too, am capable of harm, they gain discernment, not judgment, but vision. They no longer confuse unconditional love with self-destruction. They begin to say no, not out of fear, but out of sacred respect. And this, paradoxically, is when they become most magnetic. The world senses the difference. The healed empath walks with a quiet gravity. They do not chase. They do not fawn. They do not absorb indiscriminately. Their boundaries are not walls of fear, but gates of wisdom. They know who they are, and more importantly, who they are not. They have become the very force they once feared, not a monster, but a whole human. And wholeness is the most sacred power of all. In analytical psychology, we speak often of individuation, the journey of becoming oneself. For the empath, this journey is fraught with the temptation to over-identify with the archetype of the savior. But individuation is not sainthood, it is the union of opposites within. The true empath does not seek to save others as a way of avoiding their own pain. They enter the darkness consciously, find the lost fragments of their soul, and emerge not as angels but as humans fully alive. Let me pause here, not as a conclusion, but as a breath before we descend even deeper into the psychic architecture that makes this transformation possible. The empath who begins the descent into shadow enters terrain that is unfamiliar, even frightening, because for so long they have been oriented toward the other. Their consciousness has been structured outwardly to feel what others feel, to heal what others cannot, to hold what others have dropped. But now the mirror turns inward. They begin to realize that beneath the noble urge to help lies an unconscious strategy to avoid the horror of their own unmet needs, their own ancient grief, their own abandoned child. You must understand, the empath's gift is not a random trait, it is a defense mechanism, refined over years of necessity. In childhood, when the empath learned that love was inconsistent, they survived by becoming exquisitely attuned to the emotional weather of caregivers. If mother was angry, they smiled brighter. If father was distant, they became softer. If pain was present, they tried to fix it, not out of altruism, but because their nervous system could not bear the storm. So they became the calm, but the cost was immense. They learned to intuit others before they ever learned to locate themselves. Now, years later, they may sit across from someone who says, "I love you," and feel nothing but panic, not because they are unlovable, but because their system associates closeness with collapse. They may give endlessly in relationships, yet feel perpetually unseen. They may act out the martyr, yet seethe in private with bitterness they dare not name. The unconscious knows, it always knows, and it will not permit a lie to persist forever. This is why the empath snaps, because some part of the psyche, usually through a dream, a breakdown, a confrontation will say, no more. Jung often spoke of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to turn into their opposites if they are repressed or pushed too far. Light becomes dark, submission becomes rage, compassion becomes cruelty. The empath becomes what they feared, someone who walks away, someone who says no, someone who chooses themselves. And this reversal, though terrifying to the ego, is sacred to the soul, for it is not cruelty to say no to exploitation. It is not abandonment to choose one's peace. But for the empath, whose early wiring equated love with self-erasure, such acts feel like violence. That is a tragic irony. They believe they are harming others the moment they begin to protect themselves. This false belief must die in dreams. This often appears symbolically as the devouring mother or the trickster father, two archetypal figures that hold power over the dreamer's sense of worth. The empath may dream of being chaste, suffocated or trapped, they may cry in the dream, not out of fear, but out of grief for the realization that they were never truly loved for who they were, only for the role they played. This is a devastating truth. But from that devastation arises the possibility of self-love not based on performance, but on being. To snap is not to break permanently, it is to break free. But freedom, like all things of value, requires sacrifice. The empaths must sacrifice their attachment to being seen as good. They must let go of the identity that has won them approval, but costs them authenticity. They must face the terrifying prospect of being misunderstood. This, I tell you, is one of the most painful initiations to no longer be the angel in someone else's story, to become, instead, the villain in their eyes, so you can be the savior of your own soul. And here we arrive at the mystery. The snapping is not an end. It is a metamorphosis. The empath becomes the shadow, but only temporarily, and only so they can learn its language. Like Inanna descending into the underworld, they must remove the garments of persona at each gate. The garment of selflessness, the garment of niceness, the garment of spiritual superiority, until finally they stand naked before the judge of their own unconscious. And then, and only then, does the true integration begin. The shadow, you see, is not evil. It is exiled power. It is repressed instinct. It is unclaimed truth. It holds the fire of boundaries, the roar of survival, the grit of resilience. When the empath finally turns toward it, not to banish it, but to befriend it, they discover an energy they have never known, the ability to act from within rather than react from without. They are no longer at the mercy of others' emotions. They are sovereign. This new sovereignty is not loud. It is not brash. It does not announce itself with declarations. It lives in the body. The empath, once constantly flooded by others, begins to feel the edges of their own being. They notice when they are being drained. They no longer spiritualize abuse. They stop justifying mistreatment as a lesson. They realize that compassion without discernment is self-betrayal. And slowly, they begin to say the most powerful word, no. No, I will not absorb your chaos today. No, I will not silence myself to keep the peace. No, I will not conflate empathy with permission. And as they say no to others, they begin saying yes to themselves. Yes to rest. Yes to space. Yes to anger, not as an enemy, but as a messenger. Anger, properly integrated, is sacred. It is the guardian at the gate of the soul. It says, something is not right, and the healed empath listens. Now, let us look at this process through the archetype of the alchemist. The empath is the prima materia raw, sensitive, unformed. The snapping is the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution of the false self. The confrontation with shadow is the albedo, the purification, and the integration, the return to self with both light and dark embraced is the rubedo, the reddening, the completion of the great work. The empath becomes not less of themselves, but more, not a softer version of their former self, but a stronger version of their truest self. They become the one who can sit with another's pain without losing themselves. They become the one who can offer love with boundaries, not conditions. They become the one who can feel deeply without being consumed. And most of all, they become the one who no longer fears their own power. This is the great secret. The empath who feared becoming the shadow becomes it only to discover it was never evil, it was simply unloved. And once that part is loved, not indulged but integrated, the empath is no longer a fragmented being. They are whole, and wholeness is not sainthood, it is truth. It is humanity. It is divinity incarnate. There is a peculiar kind of silence that follows the snapping, not the silence of withdrawal or numbness, but a sacred stillness, a pause in the soul where all the warring parts sit in council. The empath, newly aware of the territory within, no longer rushes to rescue or to explain. They begin instead to listen to the voices that had once been cast into exile, the voice of the child who was never allowed to cry, the voice of the adolescent who was shamed for their anger, the voice of the adult who always felt too much but was told to be quiet. This council of inner voices does not exist merely as metaphor. It is a living theater within the unconscious, populated by sub-personalities, autonomous complexes that once split from the central self in order to survive. When we ignore these voices, they act out through projection. We see the tyrant in our lover. We see the victim in ourselves. We reenact the same patterns under different names, endlessly seeking to resolve what has never been truly faced. But when the empath turns inward with courage, a miracle occurs. They stop blaming others. They stop blaming themselves. They begin to see, this pain did not begin with this person. It began long before. I am reacting not only to the present moment, but to a chain of moments, an ancestral echo, a psychic inheritance that stretches back through generations. This is where the work deepens into the transpersonal. For many empaths are not only carrying their own suffering, they are carriers of collective wounds. This is why their compassion runs so deep. It is not merely personal, it is archetypal. They are attuned to the collective unconscious, that vast ocean of shared symbols, traumas, and desires that unites us all. And within this ocean swim the ancient patterns, the archetypes that shape the soul, the orphan, the rescuer, the witch, the warrior, the mother, the exile, to individuate. The empaths must stop being possessed by these archetypes. They must move from being the rescuer to being the self, the one who contains all roles but is bound by none. This is not an act of ego inflation, but of sacred grounding. The rescuer says, I must heal you to be worthy. The self says, I am whole, even when you are not. This shift is everything. It is the breaking of the spell. It is the return of the empath to their own body, their own choices, their own sovereignty. In dreams, this moment often appears as a sacred union, the dreamer marrying a stranger, merging with a mythical animal, or lighting a candle in a dark cathedral. These are not random images. They are messages from the deep psyche that integration is underway. The light has entered the shadow. The opposites are speaking, the once fragmented self is beginning to cohere, but beware the ego, which has long clung to the identity of the good one, will resist this union. It will whisper lies. You're being selfish. You're abandoning people. You're not spiritual anymore. These are the last gasps of a dying illusion. For true spirituality is not self-erasure. It is incarnation. It is the divine made flesh in all its mess and majesty. The empath who integrates shadow does not become less spiritual. They become more embodied. And the soul delights in embodiment. Here we must speak of power. Not the power that dominates, but the power that liberates. The empath who snaps and survives has touched real power, not borrowed strength from affirmation, not transient confidence from praise, but the deep-rooted power that comes from having faced death, the death of illusion, the death of pleasing, the death of dependency on external peace. This power is quiet. It is the power of a boundary spoken without apology, the power of walking away without rage, the power of saying, I don't know, without shame. The empath, once enslaved to the moods of others, now becomes a steward of their own energy. And this shift changes everything. Relationships recalibrate. Some fall away, or there's deepen. The empath no longer attracts takers because the frequency of their being has changed. They now emit self-respect, and the unconscious of others responds accordingly. And yes, some will not understand. Some will say, you've changed. And they are right. The empath has changed form from sponge to flame, from mirror to compass. They no longer reflect others back to themselves, but instead radiate a centered presence that invites but does not chase. It is here that the empath truly becomes a mystic, not because they speak of angels or energy, but because they have walked through the valley of their own dismemberment and emerged more whole. They have died to who they were told to be and remembered who they are. And this remembrance, this gnosis, is not found in books. It is born through descent, through confrontation, through fire. To become the shadow is not to lose oneself, it is to reclaim the parts that were deemed unacceptable and thus exiled. It is to re-inhabit the full spectrum of being. The empath, once afraid of their own rage, now channels it as sacred activism. Once afraid of their own desire, now honors it as divine compass. Once afraid of solitude, now relishes the company of their own soul. And so they no longer give to be loved. They give because love overflows. They no longer heal to be safe. They heal because they have become safety. They no longer feel to rescue. They feel because feeling is life. This, I tell you, is what it means to be free. Not to be numb, but to be sovereign. Not to be perfect, but to be whole. And in wholeness, the empath does not reject the world. They re-enter it, transformed. When the empath re-enters the world transformed, it is not with fanfare. It is with a steady gait, an unshakable presence, a softness that is no longer fragile but forged. They return not as the rescuer, nor the martyr, nor the wounded healer cloaked in false light, They return as the sovereign mystic, the one who has danced with both demons and angels and chosen to no longer exile either. They wear their shadow not as a secret, but as a second skin stitched together with truth. And now they can finally love, not with desperation, not with hunger, but with clarity, because the one who has befriended their shadow no longer projects it onto others. They do not fall in love with potential. They do not mistake intensity for intimacy. They do not confuse trauma bonds with twin flames. They see, they discern, they recognize the soul behind the mask, and they recognize when a soul is still wearing too many masks to meet them. In truth, the empath who has snapped and survived now walks with the archetype of the crone, the wise one, not in years, but in initiation. This being has felt too much, lost too much, betrayed themselves too many times to take illusion at face value. They do not need the world to be comfortable. They need the world to be real. And so they become dangerous, not in violence, but in vision, for nothing can be hidden from one who has seen themselves naked in the mirror of the soul. This new empath, the integrated one, is no longer the sponge absorbing every vibration that floats their way. They are the tuning fork. They set the tone. They become the source of coherence in a room, not by controlling, but by anchoring their nervous system. Once hypervigilant, becomes a sanctuary. Their voice, once hesitant, becomes a channel of clarity. Their boundaries, once patched together in fear, become expressions of divine design. They are no longer moved by pity. Pity sees people as broken. They are moved by presence. Presence sees people as whole, even when they have forgotten it. And this is the greatest gift the healed empath gives, not fixing, not rescuing, not absorbing, but witnessing. They become sacred mirrors, not sponges. They reflect truth, not pain. And in their presence, others remember who they are. But this work is not linear. There are seasons, there are regressions. There are days when the old patterns whisper seductively. It would be easier to give in, to go back, to be liked, to be needed. And sometimes the empath may slip. That is not failure. That is humanity. Integration is not perfection, it is presence through imperfection. Each return to the self is a triumph. Each no spoken with love is a revolution. Each boundary held without explanation is an act of spiritual warfare. And so I tell you, this snapping, this becoming the shadow is not a curse. It is a rite of passage. It is a soul saying, we can no longer sustain the lie that you must be good to be loved, the lie that your power is dangerous, the lie that to feel deeply is to be weak. No, to feel deeply and still hold yourself is strength. To walk into the fire and not be consumed is strength. To stand alone, trembling, and still say, this is not love is strength, in myth. So the hero does not slay the dragon to escape their fate, they slay the dragon to fulfill it. The dragon is not the enemy, it is the guardian of treasure. And for the empath, the dragon is the shadow, the rage, the desire, the wildness, the truth, To face it is to reclaim your gold, your fire, your voice. Do not be afraid of snapping. Be afraid of never snapping, of living, so contained, so silent, so suppressed that you die without ever hearing your own roar. The world does not need more obedient givers. It needs embodied souls. It needs those who can feel without drowning, speak without aggression, walk in love without becoming a sacrifice. The healed empath is this bridge between spirit and flesh, between chaos and order, between sensitivity and strength. And what does the world feel like to them now? It feels quieter, not because the world has changed, but because they are no longer tuned to every wound that isn't theirs. They listen more selectively. They grieve more consciously. They love with less attachment and more awe. They rest. They say no. They create. They laugh again, not performative laughter that masks sorrow, but the deep, shaking laughter of someone who has lived through fire and still finds the world worth smiling at. This is the promise of individuation, not escape, but embodiment. The empath who has snapped is not lost. They are found in the ruins of false identity, found in the temple of truth within, found in the stillness that comes after the storm. And they will never again forget themselves in the name of love, because now they know true love never asks you to disappear. It asks you to appear fully, holy, shadow and all